Hey, good morning. Today is day 26 of our 31 day challenge where we are studying together the book of Proverbs. So I invite you, if you would, to take the Word of God and turn your attention specifically to Proverbs 26. I've entitled this chapter, Wisdom's Conceit, because after all, it's 3 times in this chapter where you see the word conceit. It's used in this chapter more than any other chapter in the book of Proverbs. And the word conceit is the idea of eyes, or how you see yourself. And I want to encourage you to take a moment and circle each time the word conceit is mentioned here in Proverbs 26. But as you think about this idea of wisdom's conceit, first of all, I want you to notice that the first 16 verses showcase an explanation of what I'm calling from bad to worse. It's in the first 11 verses that give us bad. And then it's verses 12 through 16 that give us something much worse. The fool is bad. And so many of the first 11 verses use metaphors to make that point very clear to us. It's verses 1 and 2 and verse 7, 8, and 9, verse number 11. They're all using verbal imagery to make the point that it's ridiculous to give honor to a fool, and it's ridiculous to take advice from a fool. I mean, that's what it means when it says, so is a parable in the mouth of fools. It says that in verse 7 and verse number 9. It's like snow in the summer, or it's like rain in harvest. It's absurd, or it's frustrating when you see it happen. These metaphors help us liken the absurdity of one thing to another. Also, on the surface, it may seem like verses 4 and 5 contradict one another, but in actuality, they complete one another. Verse number 4 says, answer not a fool according to his folly, lest thou be like unto him. But then verse number 5 says to answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own conceit. And did you notice the word not in verse number 4? Do not answer. The idea is in agreement with his folly. The text says according to his folly. Because if you do, you might become like him. Don't tell him his folly is okay, because if you think his folly is okay, you're likely to become the next fool. And did you notice the word like in verse number 4? Similar to how Solomon is using metaphors to liken absurd and foolish things together, he's also implying that anyone who endorses a fool's behavior is going to be his next metaphor. This is like that, he's saying. And if you endorse a fool's behavior, then you become just like a fool. But then verse number 5 tells us to answer a fool according to his folly. So instead of endorsing the fool's behavior like a fool would, verse 5 teaches us to rebuke the fool's behavior so that the fool doesn't become wise in his own conceit. In verse 4, you're answering not a fool in agreement with his folly, but then in verse number 5, you're answering a fool on the basis of his folly, and then you're rebuking him for it. So a fool is bad, and he needs a rebuke. But remember, I said that the text is taking us from bad to worse. So what's worse than a fool? The answer is a man who's wise in his own conceit. Verse number 12 tells us that there is more hope for a fool than for him. A fool is obviously bad, and those metaphors help make that point. But a man who is wise in his own conceits, he's worse than a fool. And verses 13 through 16 illustrate that with a slothful man. He's a man who's lazy, but he's a know-it-all. In verse 13, he's making stuff up about a lion being in the streets. And in verse 15, he's described as whining. Verse 16 makes the point very clear that the sluggard is wiser in his own conceit than 7 men that can render a reason. It's as if a king has 7 wise counselors, but this whiny know-it-all sluggard thinks he knows more than the king's counselors. There's more hope for an overt fool than there is for a man who thinks he knows it all. These first 16 verses brought us from bad to worse, a fool, to a man who's wise in his own conceit. But then secondly, we now go from a sluggard to strife. We now see a know-it-all sluggard stirring it all up with strife. And I encourage you to take a moment and go through verses 17 through 22 and maybe circle each time you see the word strife. I mean, after all, grabbing a strange dog by the ears is not only unwise, but it creates unnecessary strife. And you're likely to be bit. There's no reason to meddle with that dog. There's a whole lot of stuff in our lives that we meddle with that creates unnecessary strife. A man who is wise in his own conceits thinks it's okay to meddle, and he's not going to listen to somebody when they tell him to stop, typically. Verses 18 and 19 explain this idea of acting like a madman and deceiving your neighbors. That creates unnecessary strife as well. This madman is also the contentious man of verse number 21, and he's the talebearer who's mentioned in verses 20 and 22. Now, all along the way, he is igniting strife, and he's meddling with fire, mentioned in verse 21. His strife and talebearing is creating deep wounds in the innermost part of the belly for other people. This type of person purports himself to be wise, but he's only wise in his own conceits, which isn't wisdom at all. But then thirdly, we now go from strife to an emphasis on speech. So much strife was created by the talebearer in verses 17 through 22. And now 23 through 28 focus on the speech of a talebearer. It's the speech of this man who is wise in his own conceits. And again, I encourage you, if you have the opportunity, you might circle or notate each time you find the word lips or tongue or mouth or anything that has to do with speech or verbal communication in verses 23 through 28. The speech of a man who is wise in his own conceits is wicked speech, and it's worthless speech. Silver dross is exactly that. The potsherd covered in silver dross in verse 23, it represents that which is impure and worthless. And this is the talebearer's speech. It is fair at times, verse 25 says, but it's deceitful. Be careful. Don't trust him. Notice the word deceit in verses 24 and 26. And then verse 28 tells us to avoid his lying tongue and his flattering mouth that worketh ruin. And don't forget that his heart is full of hatred. The idea of hatred is mentioned in 24, 26, and 28. This is wisdom's conceit. Don't be that guy. Don't be the know-it-all who creates unnecessary strife with your speech, and you create it through your life. Don't be that guy. Because to be proud about having wisdom makes a wise man a fool. May God help us all to avoid being wise in our own conceits. This is what the Lord taught me from Proverbs 26. If you would, please comment below and let me know what the Lord taught you as you studied this chapter. And please take time to read over the next chapter, Proverbs 27, and plan to join me tomorrow as we together study that chapter here in the Word of God.